We're on parables again. And I talked last week about the danger of parables, because the problem is we can become very comfortable with them. We can begin to assume we know everything there is to know about it. We come from behind a lens, sometimes using that age-old saying, oh, I know this one. I know this one. I know what happens. Maybe we've seen the story behind the parable played out in the life of someone else. Or sometimes, dare I say, we read the stories and we pretend they are just that, just a child's story. We can dismiss it. It doesn't have a place in the reality of our lives. And what that does is it ends up leaving us keeping God at a distance, sometimes because we're ashamed of the decisions and the actions we've made within our lives, other times because we want to be able to put down the challenges that we read, the reality of what it says to us. Last week we looked at the prodigal son, this idea of maybe it being a story that means more than just conversion and actually talks about the relationship that we can have with God every day of our lives as we turn to Him. And this morning I want us to engage with another very well-known parable. Another one that may be quite easy for us to dismiss because we've heard it. We've heard it preached on. We've heard it portrayed by children. Inevitably, some of us may well know a song about it, and we dismiss it. So in a moment, we're going to hear the story of the Good Samaritan, but before we do, I want you to consider this. You don't need to answer out loud, but I want you to consider just in your own mind, what's the main point of the story? What's the takeaway from the story? What is happening in the story? What are some of the things that happen in the story? I just want you to think for a moment, what is it that you would conclude is the reason that Jesus tells that story? As we unpick it this morning, I wonder how many of us will fall into that trap of knowing the story so well that we begin to fill in the blanks. We begin to just assume we know what happens. I was talking to someone this week. One of the challenges I face, I'm dyslexic. It's something that I've learned to dodge really well with spell checkers, unless you read my notes. But one of the challenges I face is when I read a text, after a few words, I just assume where the passage is going. So if I'm reading a book, I can find I get to the end of the page, and I know everything that happened in my version of the story, but it can be very different to what happened in the actual book. Because I don't need to read it. My mind just jumps over the bits that I've not read and just fills in the blanks. And too often, as we become familiar with biblical passages, we can do the same. That's the story of the prodigal son. I know that one. I know how it plays out. And we begin to drop elements as we craft the story ourselves. So this morning I want to challenge you and I want to ask you, please, as we hear this read to us, try and hear it with fresh ears. Try not to fill in the blanks. Try not to jump ahead in the story, but instead just hear what Jesus is saying. And we're going to journey through it and just see if we can pick up some of the things that maybe He wants to challenge us with this morning. So I'm going to invite Jane to come forward, and she's going to read for us. Thank you, Jane.
Edward's working on the garden, hoping we can sit out. So can we make it 1:30? So I said no.
Luke chapter 10, 25 to 37. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he
10:25 to
replied.
37.
"How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But Samaritan, as he travelled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise."
As I said, we're going to walk through some of the key moments in this incredible story. And I really hope that we're able to engage in it in a way where it is relevant to our lives. Not just a good story that Jesus told, not just something that's quite easy for kids to reenact for us, but something that speaks into our lives. And I want to start right at the beginning and make this point. This isn't a moment that starts with Jesus having a teaching point. This whole thing starts because someone comes to him and asks him a question. That's the root of this encounter. "Teacher," he asks, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Now, I don't want to dwell on this opening part for too long, but I do want us to consider the key moment because it's a foundation that the whole story is built upon. The gentleman comes and asks Jesus a question. And Jesus does not answer that question straight. Jesus responds to the man's question with a question. "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your strength, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." The story is built upon this foundational question: what must I do to inherit eternal life? The story of the Good Samaritan is built upon one of the most selfish questions that we see asked of Jesus. What do I need to do to secure my future? What do I need to do to make sure that I am safe and that I am secure? That's what the gentleman's asking Jesus. How do I know I'm in and not at the risk of being on the outside? And yet Jesus takes us on this journey, exploring the Christian life, a journey that becomes so much more in this short encounter than simply our final destination. Jesus uses a question about what is the end goal to paint an incredible picture of this whole life experience that we're meant to have with him. What do I need to do to secure my place in heaven? What does the law say? Love God and love those next door. Jesus responds, "Correct. Do this and you will live." This could have been one of the shortest encounters we see someone have with Jesus. It could have ended there. The gentleman comes with a question. Jesus, around about, gives him an outworking of that question, and it could finish. But we read this. But he wanted to justify himself, possibly becoming aware of the incredible selfish nature of that opening question. And so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And we begin on the Jesus 101 of answering questions. Jesus' guide to answering all questions is to either ask a question back or tell a story.
A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there,
Yuck.
he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by.
La 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 la. Wow!
Another man who worked in the temple, who was called a Levite, walked over and looked at him lying there.
Please help. Huh?
But he also passed by on the other side. Then a Samaritan came along. Samaritans were hated by Jews. They were seen as lesser people, and Jews would not interact with them. But when the Samaritan saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his
Olive oil and
donkey and
wine.
took him to an inn, where he took care of him.
One room, please.
The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here."
Jesus responds to this man's question, "Who is my neighbor?" with an incredible story. A story about an individual who is on a road, a very real road, that people that heard it first time would have been able to relate to. And this individual is beaten to within an inch of his life. It sounds like the start of a bad joke passed by an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Welshman. But instead, we don't have it as a joke. We don't have that starting. We have, again, characters that the people of the time could relate to. Individuals that those who heard it would have been seeing around them. A priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan would pass by that day. Jesus is about to unpick one of the deep ways that humanity functions in this story. I've heard this preached on. I've preached on it myself. And we get caught sometimes in the reason behind why these particular individuals could not support or help the man that day. Their roles meant that there were things that they couldn't do or they would be deemed unclean. But if we were to put that down for a moment, if we put down the lens of the titles that they are given for a moment and instead consider it another way, I wonder how many of us have ever said or thought, "I can't go there with them. What if I'm seen in that kind of place?" I don't want to be associated to that crowd. They have a bad reputation. On the flip side, I want to be around them because they are important people. I just feel more comfortable when I'm with people who think like I do. You see, the list can go on both sides of the table, why we will justify the things that we do and the people we will spend time with and the things that we will choose to avoid. What they'll reveal often, though, is our heart state towards the world. In a small way, they reveal something of how we view the world around us. It's uncomfortable to consider, but Jesus telling this story today might begin with a Baptist, an evangelical, and a recovering drug addict. Maybe he'd say a church leader, a deacon, and a member walked past. But we need to ask the question that many of us don't want to when we engage with this story. Who am I in this story? Take away the titles. Stop seeing it as a priest and go, "Well, I'm not a priest." Stop seeing it as a Levite and instead ask the question, who am I in this story? Use your actual lives, the things you do, the things you choose to avoid, and answer the question in your head, who am I in this story? Not today, sat in church, because I know the answer to that, because in church we give the right answer. But day to day, how do I conduct myself? Tomorrow at work, walking through the high street, who am I? Who am I? A man is beaten within an inch of his life. And a man walks past, a man who is created in God's image, walks past the scene of this man lying beaten, and he chooses to walk past the problem. A second man, a human created in God's image, walks past another human created in God's image and sees his need and chooses to walk past. And then a third man, created in God's image, sees another human created in God's image in need and chooses to engage with the problem. Sometimes the titles give us a get-out-of-jail-free card and we go, "Well, that's not me." But if we break this down to its very base level, we see the problem we engage with humanity, which is the choices that we make. It creates a difficult tension of us, of seeing the reality of the problems and the challenges around us, and then the response that we have in our hearts to them. Do I choose to walk past the problems that I see, pretending that I am unable to engage? Who am I in this story? Let's just look at what we have so far. A man begins with a question about his eternal destiny. Jesus asks him what the law says. The man gives an answer, and Jesus affirms that answer. Then the man dives back in with a follow-up question. Who is my neighbor? And Jesus responds by telling this story about a man who has been beaten. 3 individuals pass by that day. 2 ignore him and 1 helps. And Jesus concludes his story with a question. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? Which of these 3 do you think? You've asked me a question. Who is my neighbor? Jesus tells him a story and then asks him the question back. Who in this story is a neighbor to the man in need? Jesus never once gives a straight answer to the question of who is your neighbor. I asked at the beginning, before you heard the story spoken over by Jane, how would you conclude the story? What would be your teaching points? What would be your takeaways? I wonder how many of you drew a conclusion that Jesus somehow answered the question, who is my neighbor? Because the truth is, as we've read in the text and as we've seen, he doesn't directly answer the question at all. But the danger is we assume he does. We assume that there are things in there that aren't in there. I wonder how many of us tried to grab at some form of answer that would answer that question, who is my neighbor? But what Jesus does do by not answering that question directly, what he does do by avoiding answering that question directly, is he answers a different question. A question that can be assumed from everything we've read. Because to ask who is my neighbor is also asking the question, who is not my neighbor? And sometimes we fall into this trap, don't we? I just need to know the boundary lines of who my neighbor is. Because it'd just be good to know, is it like the people on my left and on my right? Do I need to engage with the people on my left and my right and the house opposite us? Could it be the house like 3 down on the left because they've got kids my kids' age and it's really helpful that we can kind of help each other? But 2 down from me, they are a pain. And could they not be my neighbor? And that's what we end up doing, isn't it? We read this story and we start asking the question, not who is my neighbor, but starting to say, would you mind, God, just giving me an understanding of the boundaries of how far I need to put the effort in? December the 21st. How many Christmas cards do I actually have to write for my street, Jesus? By asking who is my neighbor, the man is asking as well indirectly, who is not my neighbor? Where are the lines in the sand? Where can I stop my effort? What is enough for me? But notice what Jesus has done in his response to this man. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. In this story, I believe Jesus gives us a whole new way of understanding who neighbor is. Jesus is creating a new understanding of how a neighborhood and a community can function with the way that he engages with this. Because the neighbor to the beaten man was the one who helped him in his need. Geography and the lie of the land did not come into Jesus' answer at all. Not once did Jesus give the man a geographical reference point to understand who is his neighbor. Instead, he simply said to the man, you tell me, who was the neighbor to the man who was in need? The neighbor became the one who met that need. That's the response Jesus gives to this man, the one who stepped into the situation at a cost to himself, the one who showed him mercy when it wasn't expected. If we use this story and everything we've read and everything we've heard to base an understanding of who our neighbor is, we come to a very clear conclusion. If we were to ask, who is my neighbor, the response becomes anyone who is in need that I can show mercy to. As we read through this story, as we begin to unpick what Jesus is saying, I don't think it's unfair for us to conclude Jesus' answer to the question, who is my neighbor, is anyone who I have the capacity to come and stand alongside in their need and show mercy to. We can go around the houses, we can look at other ways of interpreting it, but if we take the words that Jesus speaks as he outlines a story to paint a picture of neighborly living, the conclusion is anyone who's in need where I can come alongside them and help in that need. Geography doesn't come into it. Geography isn't mentioned once. It changes the whole way we understand community. It changes the whole way we should engage with our neighborhood as a church. It is Jesus telling us exactly what thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven should look like. It should look like seeing need and knowing I have the capacity to play a part in supporting someone in that need. Sometimes there are going to be occasions where we can't. Sometimes there are occasions where we don't have the skill set. Sometimes there are occasions where we are at the capacity of what we can do. Jesus doesn't talk about capacity. He simply highlights, if you are looking for a way to be neighborly, look where there's need. Look where the need is and be a neighbor to those people. What would it look like if we lived this out and started showing our community what the kingdom of heaven looked like here in Wales? What happens when we stop crossing the road from the need we see on Cardiff High Street? What happens when we stop shunning those that we work with when they're going out to the pub and instead be amongst them? What happens when we stop shutting the windows because our neighbors are yelling at each other again and instead offer to see if we can be a part of helping with the stresses they're facing? What happens if we stop trying to build boundaries to understand the maximum we have to do to justify ourselves and start looking at where is there need where I can help? Who is my neighbor? The one who is in need. Who is a neighbor to the one in need? The one who comes alongside. The one who's willing to find a way to help, to meet the need that they see. You begin to wonder if the man would rather have not asked the follow-up question when the answer became so all-encompassing for his life. But just take a moment as we come to close to consider what community would look like if people stopped looking at the boundary lines and started looking at supporting one another, started seeing the need around them and finding ways to engage in it and ways to support those who are going through things. 3 people walked past an individual who was beaten half to death, and 2 of them decided not to help. Take the titles away. Take all of the justification away that you can. When we see need, how does our heart respond to it? How many of us are guilty of saying, I would give money to that person asking for money on a street corner, but there's a chance that they're going to buy drugs with it. So it's better that I don't for their well-being. They might also be buying the only meal they'll have that week. But we choose to justify our actions by building a parameter around who is my neighbor. What does it look like for me to love? And I believe in this story, Jesus changes that entire landscape if we choose to embrace what he says to us. Who is my neighbor? Who is the neighbor to this man? The one who shows him mercy. Jesus makes it pretty clear. Our neighbor is anyone that's in need when we can help. When we can help isn't measured by your importance, but by your availability to him to be the answer to someone else's prayer.